All right, we're good to go.
Thank you for having me today. My name is Graham Euning-Strufelnacht. I'm the Policy Director at Rural Vermont. You all know my organization. I don't need to say any more about us right now. Here today to give testimony on S45. My response is largely going to be based on the current version of the bill, and we're also going to be exploring parts of the other version of the bill that came through the Senate. And to some extent, I want to acknowledge that what I'm reflecting here is what we've been able to make time to understand about the bill. We haven't heard all the testimony. There's been a lot of testimony in the Senate, not as much in the House at this point. We haven't been able to do wide, comprehensive outreach to our members around this bill. We've had conversations with people who have come to us. We've had conversations as an organization, as a board. We've watched a lot of testimony. We're trying to, what you hear a lot is a lot of questions, some concerns, some things that look good to us, et cetera. And hopefully we can learn more here today. So I'll start by saying that, we understand that farmers of all scales and types are facing new and growing pressures from a diversity of sources. One being how farms and farming, in particular aspects of farming, are being seen, experienced, and responded to by neighbors and or communities as people grow further from living on farms, from being food producers themselves, from being members of rural communities who work together on the working lands and are in tight community with one another. We have greater economic inequity than in the past. More farms, farming on leased land owned by people who don't farm it and may not even live there full time. Many farmers are farming across multiple leases with multiple property owners. Farmers and our food security and food sovereignty are, in our opinion, in an ongoing crisis. They have been for a long time. Our organization began, as you all know, in 1985, when what was originally, I think, talked about as farm crisis, but it really hasn't slowed down appreciably. And dealing with unreasonable claims from neighbors about their farm operations is certainly another straw on the camel's back. We've worked with and or have heard from farmers who have dealt with complaints related to how they graze or house their livestock, how the composting operation affects neighbors, how farm odors affect or concern neighbors, how the sound of machinery affects neighbors. And I think that, I guess speaking as a farmer myself, most of us have dealt with some degree of challenging interaction with somebody at some time who objected to something we are doing. Dealing with it right now. In all of this work, we have not had any explicit suggestions this year or in recent years from our members to expand the current protections from nuisance suits that farmers have in Vermont. We have not had the opportunity to do extensive research on our membership related to this. And beyond that, we haven't seen any comprehensive research or outreach work related to how the broader ag community of Vermont is experiencing the effectiveness or lack thereof of the current statute. And this may be an important thing to do. We've heard some concerns from members of our organization, on the other hand, and from colleagues in member organizations who are also part of the National Family Farm Coalition, about, in some cases, this particular right to farm draft, but more in general, how right to farm laws in states around the country, which are different state by state, as you've heard from Ledge Council and others, have impacted communities and small and independent farms, including dairy farms, abilities to hold large operations owned by very large corporations such as Smithfield, Cargill, JBS, accountable for the human and environmental health impacts they create, and to have a degree of local control over the impacts to local communities and how to respond. We also recognize, and national allies fighting right to farm laws in their states have acknowledged in conversation that Vermont has a very different agricultural culture and economy than other states. Even the largest farms in Vermont, to our knowledge, are independently owned. We're not talking about Smithfields, JBS, MSOs like multi-state operators or multi-country operators who are largely unaccountable. And have an incredible amount of capital that we brought to bear against communities and other farms. And we do not face the same type of corporate actors and degree of threat posed by their contracted farm businesses, making this conversation and consideration of appropriate protections more nuanced and complicated here. In this respect, we think that contextualizing Vermont's law in relationship to other states' laws is going to be an important thing for the legislature to further consider. It's one thing to hear Ledge Council and others describe the different legal regimes in different states. It's another to explore what the different agricultural economies and cultures look like in these states, how these right to farm laws may have affected different types and scales of farms, positive and or negative, how they may have impacted surrounding communities in these states, what types of legal battles have been fought around them. And that's not something I can provide. I can certainly provide some connections to people who have been approaching these in other states. But in that respect, I think one thing we all know well is Vermont. And I want to talk a little about, Vermont. This is an excerpt from Vermont, from Vern Grubinger's 2022 census reflection on the VAFM website. Vermont has 6,537 farms, down 4% from 2017. We have 1,173,890 acres of farmland, but we lost almost 20,000 acres since 2017, presumably to development. These declines are attributable in part to the loss of 313 dairy farms over the same 5 years, a drop of 37%. The number of milk cows declined less by 18%. The fluid milk produced by remaining cow dairies accounts for 58% of all ag sales in Vermont. Further, there are 265,275 forage acres, 110,000 pasture acres, 74,800 corn silage acres, most of which feed cattle. And Vern says these data show how important dairy is to our agricultural economy and landscape, and I think all of us agree. Looking back 20 years to the 2002 census, we had 6,571 farms, about the same as today, but 1,500 of them were dairies. So nearly 1,000 farms have shifted from dairy to other products, making agriculture more diverse. We now have 744 farms selling veggies, 471 selling berries, 507 in the greenhouse and nursery business, 441 orchards, 266 farms selling Christmas trees. Over 1,300 farms with laying hens, over 200 with broilers, over 100 growing turkeys, 1,500 farms with beef cows, over 1,000 with horses, 400 farms with goats, 300 farms with pigs. Vermont leads the nation in maple production. Our agricultural, Vern goes on to say that our agriculture may be diverse, but it's also consolidated. And you saw that, for example, we talked about where the percentages of that 58% of all agricultural sales are accounted for in dairy. Just 3% of our farms account for 2/3 of all agricultural sales. And it is true, people have come in and talked about how, what qualifies as a farm in the census is pretty big. You only need $1,000 to qualify, whereas in Vermont's laws, you need $2,000, I believe, of gross income to qualify as a farm. So you are covering a lot of folks who might be really small. And if you look at that, Vern's explanation further, roughly half of those 6,500 farms he talked about, forget the actual figures, but aren't making that much. So let's say there's 3,500 that are making tens of thousands of dollars of gross income a year, as opposed to just over that $1,000 threshold. So this is not Vern, this is me, that we have to also contextualize these economic figures. Gross sales doesn't necessarily reflect the health of a business or sector. So we saw in the same time with these gross sales that in those 5 years, we lost 30% of Vermont's dairy farms, despite that incredible economic production they're creating and food production. So I work to describe Vermont's food system in even some numerical fashion here, and quoting Vern, and Farm to Plate clearly has done a lot of work on this too, because the farm food sectors in Missouri, in Oregon, and in other states that Ledge Council mentioned having right to farm laws that are more expansive than ours don't necessarily present an equivalency to what we have or want here. We need a law suited to what we have and want in Vermont. So for most of the farmers and farm workers we work with locally and nationally, expanding these types of protections have not come to the surface as, again, one of those things they've been asking us to work on, and have not been the primary determinant, according to them, of whether they effectively have the right to farm. As I started off saying, the right to farm for these folks is effectively determined by things like access to capital, access to farmland and housing, lack of adequate antitrust enforcement of agribusiness, the lack of a pay price, including the cost of production plus profit, the challenges of making a livelihood working on farms and running farms. If we talk to those 313 dairy farms that went out of business in those 5 years, and the other types of farms as well that went out of business, because there's a lot of those that aren't discussed there, it'll be interesting to hear from them how much these protections and the potential expansion of these protections would have affected their ability to stay in business. For us, this conversation isn't about, or can't be about, impugning or privileging any particular scale or type of farm, or a particular scale or type of farm's right to farm. Regardless of scale and type, as farms grow and diversify and change, there's still a level of responsibility for the impacts they're creating, and they still must have reasonable protections from frivolous or poorly intentioned actions by neighbors and or other entities. This conversation is about what degree of entitlement food producers, farming, and farmers have of any scale or type, that they are given with respect to protection from nuisance suits or potentially trespass or more, due to the essential nature of farming and food production and the inherent nuisances it may cause. What degree of allowance farms have to negatively affect their neighbors, communities, and the environment. It also has to do with what degree of protections and agency neighbors and communities have in relationship to farms, which they perceive to be creating issues relating to the public good. So that's just sort of my intro to say that this is a really important conversation for all folks to have. We do need to look at these laws. We do need to consider their ups and downs, how they played out across the country. And this is one mechanism for potentially affecting people's ability to farm more viably. So getting into the draft, I didn't reference the sections that well. I'll do my best as I go through here, but you all can follow along. Just one reflection I had starting, you all have also talked about the Farm Security Special Fund. You all heard from Sam Smith at the Intervale Center Farm Viability Program. And in talking about that Farm Security Special Fund, one of the things that Sam mentioned a couple of times, both in the private meetings and with you all, is that we don't want farms building this fund into their business plan. And I think in the same sense, we don't want farms building this law into their business plans. These are things for emergencies, when essential farming activities done in a responsible way are being inappropriately challenged, and to support folks in having protection and ability to adapt, and or for regulations to adapt. They're not something that should be needed often, ideally in very rare circumstances. So getting into the definitions, generally accepted ag practices part. So this changes, this says that letter D, I didn't write the page down. I'm sorry. I thought I'd be bringing you all around. It's in the definitions section. I think it's on page 2. It says D, practices conducted in a manner consistent with proper and accepted customs and standards. This is basically where you change the definition to talk about generally accepted ag practices as being the standard. And we don't have any issue on first glance or in our conversations with the specificity now being proposed in terms of generally accepted ag practices. Like, in fact, that seems like a potentially helpful clarification given some of the ambiguity in current language and law. But we did highlight this letter D as something we wanted more clarity on. It says practices conducted in a manner consistent with proper and accepted customs and standard, followed by similar operators of ag activities in the state. And, as we were talking about this, presumably any of these activities would be covered in the previous definitions here, the REPs, all the ones that are cited there. As you appropriately pointed out in previous testimony, Representative Nelson, like the CAFO laws aren't all encompassing of certain types of farms, we shouldn't imagine. But the whole purpose of here is to cite, realistic ag activities, right? And make sure that they're included, they're not considered a nuisance. So I'm wondering what examples make this letter D necessary? What are we concerned about not falling under those other bullets, A, B, and C? And I think there's one after E. There's been a lot of talk about the need to make this law more clear, but this is something that seems like it moves in the opposite direction. There's a little bit of a lack of clarity. I don't know.
Yeah, what do you think in terms of, like, I think of an example of, defining what is conducted in a manner consistent with proper and accepted customs and standards. So, it used to be that you kept chickens in a barn, right? And didn't pasture them. Well, what if you decide you want to raise laying hens or meat birds and do it through pasturing, but you don't have a lot of acreage. You have a neighbor on, that surrounds your property or it's on one edge. And, either the sound of the chickens or the smell becomes an issue, right? You're doing something that's different than what used to be an accepted practice for meat birds, right? Where they were kept in the barn, but now we're pasturing them. And the smell, is potentially going to be an issue. Is that an example of something where
it's actually a really interesting example because we were working with, composters who were having poultry forage on compost piles. Yeah. And we were told that's not an agricultural activity.
Oh, contrary.
Well, we can talk more about this, this conversation has happened over years and there's still waiting for some rules. And it's not my specialty, it's Caroline's. So the types of things like this have come up, but my understanding would be in that situation, like, as someone who's worked on farms where we raise hundreds of meat birds every year, like through those methods, like that would be protected under the RAPs. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say, but that's the kind of question I'm wondering, like what
We can get clarified.
Yeah, that would be really clear. Maybe Stephen can speak to it, or maybe Ledge Council can speak to it, or maybe someone can, but I would hope that we fall under the RAP.
Sure, I guess the point I'm trying to make is, I think farmers are having to become innovative all the time. So you're doing something new that no one else has done. So, and that's usually a good thing. Like it can be, and that it might be a bad idea, but, and that, we need to be careful with how we do those in terms of nuisance lawsuits. But it's not a bad thing to encourage farmers to be innovative and do
Absolutely.
something different, but this would potentially discourage it, and that's why.
Some of these are market-driven changes. And the market is asked for chickens to be kept in a more humane manner.
Yeah.
And pasture-raised chickens, those eggs command a price. And it's a great practice, but you're right, and the new practices and ag is innovating all the time, so how do we make sure that's drawn into generally accepted ag practices? And
Right. Well, not leaving a door open for potentially like, I guess I'm trying to read what that could leave a door open. I'm looking at other states and we're looking at some of those impacts. We're like, when we have something that's like a little ambiguous like that, there's just this question of like, what could it leave a door open to? Because it could leave a door open to, like you're saying, really progressive innovation. Right. It could also leave a door open to someone, a bad actor, pushing that in another direction. So there's more information will be helpful. That's a clarifying question for us. And there's a fair number of clarifying questions because we don't have a lawyer on staff. We don't give legal advice as an organization. We seek that advice. But this bill is very convoluted. It jumps around a lot.
Representative O'Brien, question or
Thank you, Dave.
comment on that?
Yeah, this also, I don't know how it would play out again, but say like organic certification is a different bar than the RAPs, and this seems to somehow, I don't know if it would be good, positive or negative, but I could see, it's saying they're following by similar operators. So say NOFA standards might be different than the RAPs in some ways, and I don't know if that gives potential nuisance suits, a place to get at or not.
so
Hang on a second. Were you asking the witness that question, John?
I was just, you could speak to it, and
I would think I would invite, I think NOFA Vermont and VOF, Organic Farmers, would probably be the best ones to answer questions around organic certification and how they do or don't fit in the definitions included here. Yeah, I don't have a specific answer around organic certification and how, those practices are not challengeable based on the other language in here.
Representative Nelson?
yeah, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, but generally accepted agricultural practices, my cows can be raised in a barn with proper care and ventilation and good husbandry standards. It's also generally accepted agricultural practice that cows can be pastured and rotational grazed and let outside when the weather is conducive. We don't put them out when it's 40 below. You don't put them out when it's 110, but they're let outside and they can be pastured and taken care of that way too. So generally, it's two practices that are different, but are both accepted. And
I'm just wondering about
Yeah.
what's the Ben and Jerry's program about the humanely raised cows?
yeah, they score.
Just when we
Yeah.
start getting into something beyond the wraps, I don't mind if there's a higher bar, but if there's sort of multiple possibilities here for what your agricultural practices are judged at.
Right. And there are a number of, bullets there that articulate like what's inclusive of that as well.
So for a number of different reasons here, maybe this is something we want to get a little more input on and have more conversation about this section D.
And it may very well be the case that, like you're saying, organic farmers or particular types of farmers are saying, recognizing and have an issue and say like, this isn't included. And I'm really concerned about this and we should address that and figure out what it is. And maybe that's already come up in testimony and I haven't seen it. The next section is just the definition of nuisance on page 4. It says nuisance means any interference with reasonable use and enjoyment of land, including interference from smoke, odors, particulate matter, dust, noise, or vibration. The second part of the paragraph says nuisance as used in this chapter includes all claims that meet all the requirements of the definition, regardless of whether a complainant designates a claim as brought in nuisance, negligence, trespass, or any other area of law or equity. So I think the second half of the definition elicits the most concern and question as it refers to negligence, but that's also referred to later in the proposal. This is where this whole thing, I almost wonder if it's like, it's like you have some things on the positive and negative side. Could we just cancel them out at some point? Like it's hard for me. It's a little hard for us to tell reading through this bill, like, for example, how negligence is treated. It's at once written in, if a suit is brought in negligence here, it'll be treated as nuisance. But later on, it says a farmer is not qualify, well, it's not eligible for the rebuttable presumption or this exemption, these protections, if they are found to be negligent. And that's just confused. It's very confusing to try to understand how to figure that out. I think it'd be confusing for farmers and communities. And I'm not a lawyer, but I don't know how if there's a clear answers on that, it would be great to have that. It also refers to trespass and any other area of law or equity if it relates to reasonable use and enjoyment of land, including these new particular aspects of potential nuisance. And that seems very expansive. And given the sightings of these terms here and other places in legislation, like I said, it would be helpful to have further clarity over what this effectively means and what particular things may fall under negligence, trespass, or any other area of law or equity that folks are concerned about being not covered by nuisance. Nuisance usually based on our understanding is based on something that happens on the farm property, but which may affect people off the property. Whereas trespass is something that happens off of the farm property on somebody else's property. That's a big step to take. And if we're going to consider moving this direction, I think we just need a clear understanding of why, if this is the most reasonable or effective means of meeting the concerns of the farming community in its entirety, what the risks are, and whether the farming community in its entirety supports these changes. Happy to take any thoughts or questions on that, but that's around that definition piece.
Yeah, why don't we keep moving just because we've got to cover here.
Quickly, I go into like the second, like the former definition, which is basically rooted in showing that the activity has a substantial adverse effect on health, safety, or welfare, or has a noxious and significant interference with the use and enjoyment of the neighboring property. That current definition doesn't specify particular things that may cause impact, but rather the necessity of a type of impact being created. And there's certainly some ambiguity there. There's also some concern we have about naming the particular potential consequences of farming as nuisances, regardless of their scale or intensity or impact on health and safety and welfare. And again, given that we haven't had people suggest these changes or come supporting them from our membership, we just want to understand what does this look like? Beyond the people we've seen in testimony here, we have 6,500 farmers in Vermont. Like even if you count that, cut that in half, thinking about like, what is what kind of commercial, what's the commercial nature of this? What's the production output of this? Who's supporting that? Who's asking for this? Who's this going to affect? From the Senate bill, it says no agricultural activity shall be or become a nuisance or trespass when the activity is conducted in accordance with the generally accepted ag practices. And then it goes on to say a plaintiff alleging that an agricultural activity is a nuisance shall have the burden of proving beyond a preponderance of evidence that the agricultural activity issue is not entitled to the nuisance protection because the agricultural activity is not conducted in accordance with the generally accepted ag practice. So understanding their qualifiers, which we're about to discuss, this language is in both drafts, and it again brings up some concerns and questions. This directs the law away from the impact and the potential transgression itself and towards laws and other frameworks for regulating farms and practices and whether or not farm is or was theoretically in compliance at the time a particular incident may have occurred. Understanding there's not day-to-day regulatory oversight of farms. It was seen that particular negative impacts, and I'm not talking about the smell of spreading manure or like these things that are inherent aspects of farming, but some of the significant ones that we've heard about in larger stories, would be an indication that there was negligence, that there is not compliance. And I'm wondering, how things like negligence referred to later as disqualifying a farm from eligibility are determined and by whom. Ledge Council cited a situation in Oregon in which a forestry outfit was using, quote unquote, a forestry outfit was using helicopters to spray their stands with pesticide, and they inadvertently sprayed at a residential subdivision. But the Oregon law protected the outfit because the Oregon law protects against trespass. That's what Ledge Council said. So I know that law is written differently for this one in Oregon, but it's an example of, I don't think we want a situation like that to be protected action, whether due to the allowance for trespass, the inclusion of particular trespass or negligence claims under nuisance or otherwise. This is an extreme example, but as we reference laws in other states in service of expanding our laws, we also need to consider the impacts those laws in those states have had at the same time.
And Nelson.
Yeah, Graham.
Yeah.
RAPs, required agricultural practices, require that pesticides, herbicides stay on my land.
Licensed applicators have their own.
And we got to be licensed applicators to use that. So even with this passed, what happened in Oregon wouldn't fly in Vermont. Literally, you don't fly on herbicides in Vermont. That's
It's not the
illegal.
scale. It's also not the scale we have.
And we can fly on winter rye. That's about it. So that one case, when we discussed that with Ledge Council in here, it's just required ag practices, our licenses say we can't do that. So that's understanding the generally accepted practices and the required
Right.
practices.
Well, this is where we get to the question too, about what's included or what's not included in those protections. The pesticide rule is a part.
Mhm.
And other states don't have the same rules, not only the same right to farm laws, but the same agricultural standards, as you're saying.
But we all have the same pesticide standards. I don't know how that worked in Oregon. Of course, it was a forestry.
Yeah, it was a confusing thing.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Nevertheless, I think that question of trespass and what it means to say, that whether a complaint designates as a claim brought in nuisance, negligence, trespass, or any area of law or equity be treated as nuisance. So if evidence is required to be shown, and here, this is getting to the plaintiff part, and this is where this is about if evidence is required to be shown by the plaintiff in terms of non-compliance of the farm, as opposed to the farm demonstrating compliance, just objectively, what are the limitations or opportunities for the plaintiff to demonstrate this? Like, does it require expertise over ag law or even the farm and potentially it's an MP, for example, if it has one, or other things that may demonstrate regulatory compliance? Is it difficult in general for a farmer or VAFM to prove compliance? Like, what does that look like? I was a little surprised that one witness testified that VAFM asserts that government is not going to intervene in the right to farm lawsuits and say whether practices are compliant. So if the regulator won't attest to compliance, the lack thereof, who's best suited or most appropriate to determine compliance from the perspective of efficiently and effectively answering this question? And again, it may be helpful to have examples locally and nationally exploring what kinds of nuisance suits are generally being brought, how both parties are feeling in terms of that process meeting their needs, how hard it is for a farm to prove they are eligible in compliance, where they have to, and how hard it is for the plaintiff to where they have to. Ultimately, assuming best interest, our goal here is to determine who is best positioned to determine compliance and other factors of eligibility. We're not trying to make it harder for any party to determine compliance. So it's more of a clarifying question. Are we trying to make it harder for one party to determine whether someone's compliant or not? Like who is the best position to do this? And if it includes like having to know intricacies of a farm's business plan or their NMP, like that would be really hard for a neighbor to do. It's one thing for the neighbor to have to prove they're creating a nuisance. Like that is definitely seems like in the floor of the plaintiff. But when you're talking about the farmer proving whether or not they're eligible for the protections, I'm wondering, like, can the plaintiff, what's the ability that the agency of the plaintiff to essentially prove that? Is the farm better positioned to assert their compliance and then gain the eligibility? Again, it's a question. I'm curious to hear different people's responses to it. VAFMs, ledge councils.
Representative O'Brien.
I have a question, Steve, that came out of Graham's testimony, if that's
I
okay.
think we should
I can,
yeah, let's hold off on that.
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
To extend this concept somewhat, I was just thinking this through, and if we're considering leaning on the generally accepted ag practices, the primary barometer for whether or not something may be considered a nuisance, as opposed to the impact itself, then in the case in which a farm is in compliance, is creating a problem without negligence, like they're doing everything in compliance, but there's still a problem being created, potentially a trespass, let's say, is the state or the federal government or the regulatory authority, as opposed to the farm, then implicated or liable? Like, I agree, like the farm, if they're in compliant, and if it's shown that they're compliance, then they're following the law. So shouldn't the enforcer of the law or the state or the federal government be the one who's truly responsible in that instance? I don't know the answer to that legally, but just following the logic there, I found it really complicated to believe that, okay, a farmer has done everything. They've proven this. Why are they being held responsible if they're shown to be in compliant? Doesn't that reflect really poorly on the regulations themselves? Yeah, it brings up significant questions related to how one farm may impact another as well, and exploring the potential positive and negative impacts of a change like this would be helpful. I think, again, we have to remember that across the country where these laws have happened, we've seen farms affecting other farms too. This isn't just about, like the crap we all experience, on our farms all the time. So all of the limitations to when a nuisance applies beginning at the bottom of page 6. So this is saying nuisance will not apply if there's negligent operation, if there's substantial adverse on public effect on public health and safety, if it will not affect people's ability to recover the images or damages sustained. It includes water pollution and the ability of the state to essentially act in the interest of the public good. So the language of these contingencies paired with the suggested language and definition of the nuisance and/or trespass, again, makes it hard to understand for us. And I would imagine for farmers and community members, what may or may not be covered and what may or may not disqualify someone from protection when it all shakes out. Like words like substantial, public health, safety, environment, welfare, what abilities to recover damages are being referred to. What does including in the nuisance definition any other form of law or equity mean in the context of these other seeming protections? In terms of, and I know we can't answer all those questions, you're not going to be able to exhaustively, make a list. But I think and you all know what I mean, when you have something like a substantial adverse public effect, what are we talking about? What does including in a nuisance, blah, blah, blah. In terms of the weather contingencies, I don't think that's really, I'm not commenting that much on them here. I don't know what's most appropriate if we're going to look at this. We just worked so much on the Farm Security Special Fund. And that was really all about looking at like what threshold of weather event qualifies as an extreme event. And I would, again, so I would look to that process. I would look to the experts. If this is coming from them, then, we would probably support what experts are suggesting, because it is clear that there are times when there are extreme events, whether it's winds, whether it's even wild animals going through your fencing, whether it's rain or flooding events, incredible snowstorms that drop a lot of snow and destroy structures or critical infrastructure that creates damage, that need to be accounted for. That certainly aren't negligence, but are just, the act of extreme weather. So there's getting towards the end here, there's a place that says this chapter is remedial in nature and shall be liberally construed to effectuate its purposes. And there again, it's just this clarifying question. We were talking at the beginning of this law, and a lot of the conversation was making this more clear. And when we say things like liberally construed to effectuate its purposes, in the context of this particular chapter, what does that mean, given some of the ambiguities and potential places of contestation that may happen? In the same section on liberal construction, there is some naming of the allowances for farms to change types, practices, etc. The bill also no longer refers to the protections only for pre-existing farms in some respects. And this is where I think there's some where we had less concern and more, hey, this is really interesting. This could be really, you don't have many questions about this. The previous language is really ambiguous. It wasn't clear what it meant when people were changing their practices, et cetera. We need to clarify that. We need to make sure that, and I would also say, we can't just protect pre-existing farms. We need more farmers. We need more farmers. We need to protect anybody, no matter if they were farming before their neighbor was there or not. If you start a farm, you should get the protections. You should be treated like any other farmer. And I don't even think that's actually necessarily in this current draft, but that was something we discussed as an organization as being, why isn't this there?
In this bill, it says if the land's been fallow for 5 years and it returned back to agriculture, it gets all the protections as if it's been farmed right straight through, regardless of whether it was a dairy farm and now goes to become a diversified farm. And in the version hanging on the wall, it said 10 years, which I like because then it covered land. Not that Vermont has a lot of land in CRP, but if we did, of course, that's an 8-year contract for CRP. Yeah.
What's CRP?
Cropland Reserve Program. And, there's not a lot of it in Vermont. I don't know if there's any right now, but there are other places in the world, in the country, there is. CRP.
Nevertheless, it just made us think because, we talk about these new beginning farmers, they're coming with little access to capital, They're trying to get on land. Often that land is probably not big acreage of ag land. It's far from neighbors for a lot of these folks when they're starting off. They're probably closer to neighbors. I mean, I'm thinking of certain farms that started up in suburban areas in central Vermont this number of years, and they're often very successful and doing well with their neighbors, but those people aren't carrying these protections. And it would make sense for everybody who's farming.
They're gonna have the protections of this bill.
That's a positive thing.
Yeah.
Representative Boslin, and then Graham, we should.
I'm almost-
I'll try to get through.
The last two paragraphs, I'm sorry.
So I can't wait to the end if it's easier.
Why don't you go ahead and your testimony then, Graham?
Well, there's one thing about what Representative Nelson was just saying, like around that language about farms still having protection, even if they aren't active anymore for 5 years. And I was trying to understand, like, is that saying that once an ag operation ceases, it's no longer eligible, or is it saying that once an ag operation ceases, that they're no longer getting the protections, right? Because they're no longer a farm.
If it becomes a farm within 5 years.
So it's about the length of time.
Yes,
This is assuming sort of pre-existing notion
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
only pre-existing farms.
yeah,
Right,
it
right.
takes that out.
Right. We're saying that there shouldn't be any time frame. Probably there should be any and all farms who start from anywhere to get these protections. Is one of the things we're suggesting.
I don't disagree with that.
So clarifying how farms may change the practices, like I said, it's really important. If a farm wants to change how it's farming and what's growing, that shouldn't impact its eligibility for the protections. So in conclusion, we've seen some folks describe votes for or against this as either supporting farmers or not. From our perspective, that's not a statement we agree with. We're not coming here for or against the bill. We're acknowledging that we have a lot of questions. We have some concerns. We have some things we like or would propose. Ultimately, we would like more information. But from what we've heard from farmers in Vermont and other states who certainly support we've heard from people who support farmers but do not support this bill or right to farm legislation in general. Disagreeing with someone about how to best support farms and other goals of this legislation doesn't mean that one side does or doesn't support farmers. If we want to understand how to best support farmers in issues like this, it'd be helpful to gather more information from a breadth of stakeholders through a deliberate and comprehensive process that may help to balance the declared purposes of the bill. Those declared purposes are protecting agricultural production as an economic contributor, preserving agricultural lands and environmental resources, increasing tourism, furthering self-sufficiency of the people, and preserving agriculture to benefit public health and welfare. That's all I got.
Right, Representative Boslin.
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple times in your talk that it would be useful to have sort of a statewide survey or broader information from farmers in general across the state in terms of how they would feel about these things. Because I guess I kind of have the same thought as you that probably different farmers have different perspectives. And I'm just wondering on a practical basis, how complicated would that be to have, rural Vermont, NOFA, and maybe, I don't know if the Department of Ag has a listserv of farmers or something to just send out a survey and say, hey, this is the bill. What are your thoughts? Is that feasible? I don't know how we've had, probably 10 farmers have come in to talk to us in different forms. And some of them said, wow, I have an organic farm and my neighbor's pesticides are coming into my pond and this is really a problem. And this would be a problem. And then there are other people who say, oh, this would be great. This will protect us. But how could we get that information, I guess? Like, is that feasible? If we said we need to gather information from farmers, could we do that before the end of the session? Or is that not feasible?
I guess part of my, the information that would be helpful, I think, for us would be having some more of an intensive, comprehensive understanding of folks across the state. I don't think something like that could be done before the end of this session. I don't know what it would look like. When the RAPs were first constructed, the state did a statewide tour talking about this. It's hard to say what an ideal process would look like. I'm not the best person to ask. I think asking BAFM, talking to the Farm Bureau, talking to NOFA, talking to all of us together could probably think about this together. My goal would be, or just to make sure we're hearing from people, to come in front of the public and to speak in favor or in particular against this bill, or even just to raise concerns about aspects of this bill is a hard thing because farmers they understand the situation other farmers are in. Even if they don't agree sometimes with practices or how things are rolling out, people want to support each other. They understand that people are making decisions in a really hard environment and things happen. And I think it's a lot to ask, people to come in, especially people who might be more critical of the bill, to be recorded saying certain things sometimes. It's not saying people shouldn't be accountable for the opinions they have. It's just saying that, this is as we all know, like I said, people have said under testimony that a vote against this bill was a vote against farmers. Like, that's a really tough environment for a farmer to come in and speak their mind on. So something where there's some sort of both a public process, but also maybe an anonymous way of,
Thank you for that, Graham, and thank you for all that you've shared. This, I think that you're saying something important for all of us to hear. I also just want to say, in sort of response to your suggestion, Representative Boswell, and we're going to hear from some more farmers right now, and then later in the week. This bill also affects people who aren't farmers. It affects neighbors, the people who would be the plaintiffs in a suit, either today or tomorrow under an existing law or new law. So I think we need to be mindful of that too. That this affects the public. If you're all set, Graham, I think maybe we should move on, because we've got other witnesses who are hoping to testify. I think it's going to be probably a challenge to hear from all of them this morning, but let's see what we can do. And we have with us in the room Frank. Good morning. And thank you for joining us and being patient. And sometimes hearing other testimony can be useful, I know. And
It actually was.
that's good.
My name is Frank Kemp. I'm from Cabot, and there's a couple other Caboters in the room. I'm here to testify on the bill from both perspectives. I'm a small farmer, part-time. I would say part-time farmer. I don't farm for a living. I'm now retired, but it's a big part of my life. Also have surrounded by other farms where I live in Cabot. So I want to kind of go through my experiences. It's not so much with the bill, because this bill has never come into play with my experiences, but it is related to it and could at some point in the future. And I'm going to try not to read from my written testimony. I wrote it down, but I just want to kind of talk to it. So about myself, my wife and I live on a 15-acre farm in Cabot. We raise cows for beef that we sell for ourselves, and we sell some. We raise meat chickens. We have layer chickens. We sell eggs. My wife is big into gardening. We have lots of fruit trees, lots of fruit, raspberries, blueberries. I mean, across the board. We raise more corn than we can eat, so we either sell or donate it to the local food shelf. So we're kind of like a multi-use farm, homestead ourselves, but then we have a lot of excess. So my perspective of everything is from a small farmer perspective. And I also keep bees. Which is very helpful when it comes to the garden. From the perspective of being a farmer with protections, my experiences around that would actually come around bees, because I do have a neighbor who takes issues with my bees. And my other neighbors are actually thrilled that I have bees. But this one neighbor has, given me a lot of issues about where I keep them, and I've accommodated everything that his requests, but he'll still publicly disparage me in public meetings about my beekeeping. I do have a fear at some point in the future there could be a lawsuit of some sort because he got stung by a bee. So I don't know how he proved it was my bee, because there are also several other beekeepers. Greg's only 2 miles as a bee flies from me, and Zach has bees. Zach still brings bees to your place.
Yeah.
Yeah, bees go everywhere.
There's no wild hornets and stuff around your
Oh,
place.
yes,
though,
there
no?
is. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, and I gotta be careful of those because they like to eat bees. Um, so that's one perspective. The other perspective, and this is the one I feel more strongly about because I get along with my neighbors. Well, let me finish there. I know my neighbors aren't going to always be my neighbors. And I also understand the concern that drives a lot of this is people from out of town coming in and buying next to farms and not living, I grew up in a big city, so I know there's a huge change, but I actually moved to the country because I wanted to live a farm lifestyle. I actually hated living in the city when I grew up. But I understand and concern, people just don't have a concept what it's like to live in farm country if if they're coming from the suburbs. And so I understand that perspective. One of my big concerns is I have a neighbor who is a bad actor. He's also a farmer. He lives uphill from me. He has 5 acres. He buys and sells livestock. He keeps poultry. And there's been a number of issues where, well, when we bought our house 15 years ago, next to our house is one of his pastures, small strip of pasture. That pasture is like 90 feet from our house. So that pasture has now become his vehicle to harass us, which is kind of why I'm here testifying. It's like, I want to support this bill, but I want the legislators to be careful not to protect bad actors. That's my big concern. And give you an idea of what happened. One of the things that happened is he used to run a dog mill, and his dogs sometimes run free. And we have a dog ordinance in Cabot, and I filed a dog complaint, and we had a hearing. The next day after the hearing, he goes and takes his manure pile and uses his tractor and dumps it as a windrow of manure right along that property line. 90 feet from our house, 30 feet from our well. I talked to a lot of people. They say, bring the state in. The state, I filed a complaint with the state. The state came and investigated. I saw people come. They never talked to me. They just took my complaint. A little bit more than a year later, I had to every few months bug the state and say, where are you at? Where are you at with this? They issued a letter saying that they can't enforce it because at the time of their inspection, he only had 3 cows. He had 10 at the time. He typically has 10 to 15 cows. So therefore, it doesn't fall under the RAPs because it's too small. But they advised him that he should follow the RAPs, and if there was problems in the future, they would help me test the water to determine if there's any impacts. I kind of took it as I don't have a lot of faith in the state now. I have a UV system on my well. It was actually a new well. I put a UV system on because I don't want to end up with E. coli in my water and discover in a way of getting sick first. So I just put the UV system in. And I'm still testing my well just to make sure every year or two. To relate that, not all farmers are created equal. He sued me in small claims court over a shared spring. And in court, he actually brought up this whole issue of the manure pile along the line, which I don't understand why he brought it up, other than it was near my well. In court, he actually testified to the judge. He goes, my land is agricultural. I can do anything I want, and they have to deal with the consequences. I just bring this up because I want you to understand Vermonters are great people, but there are a small percentage that aren't that great. And they have attitudes like that. And people like that, Greg is a great farmer in Cabot. My other neighbors are great farmers. Ian runs a really big maple operation right across the road from me. We're on Class 4 road. He runs an old milk truck up and down. Mud season, it destroys the road. As soon as he's finished hauling, he grades the road. For all of us, because he's a considerate neighbor. A lot of great people out there. There are some bad actors. Another thing he did, he went and bought a bunch of guinea fowl. I don't know if you guys know about guinea fowl, how loud they can be. And he usually raises his poultry up around his house and barn, which is like almost a football field up the hill from us. But he went and took a dog kennel with a cage thing, moved it down to the property line and put the guinea fowl down near our property. He then, at a later time, admitted to another neighbor that he specifically did that to get at us. Just another action of a bad actor. I just wanted to relate. So to get to the bill, and I don't know where the wording of the bill is because I saw the original markup in the Senate, and then it was coming over here, and Amber told me the judiciary is going to work on it, so I haven't looked at it since it passed the Senate. So I kind of just generalized my things. One of the things that concerns me is the bill does provide for negligence. I view my neighbor's actions and a bad actor's actions is more malicious than negligence. And I kind of wonder if malicious should be included as along with negligence. In the case of my neighbor, I mean, he freely talks about getting at us. If I ever ended up having to take civil action, because like I said, the state wouldn't enforce the wraps because he's too small. Having a malicious exception would be helpful. And that would also help, I think, generally from a bad actor standpoint. The other aspect is, given that small enough farms aren't regulated by the wraps, and I don't know what other regulations, I don't know where I have no understanding of any of the pesticide regulations. I didn't see in a bill as to how small of a farm is protected by this bill. Could someone who just has a backyard garden claim they're farming and be protected by the bill? It's just a general question is given that, just in the wraps that there's a size that gets regulated, should there be some correlation to that in this bill defining what size farm gets protections? My next thing was the generally accepted agricultural practices, which was valuable listening to the other testimony because I kind of had a similar thing in my head of what does that mean? Because when we moved to Canada, we started keeping cows. Every farmer I talk to keeps their cows differently. So I, as a farmer, don't know what would be generally accepted, and other than I think I'm doing things correctly. As a beekeeper, I actually have more resources. The Vermont Bee Association has documented best practices. There's some nationwide, the Bee Health Coalition and some other ones, they have documented best practices. Because I've learned as a beekeeper, if you ask 10 beekeepers, well, how do you deal with this situation? We'll get way more than 10 answers. So I find it confusing because I don't know what that means as if I was on the side of the fence where I'm suffering a nuisance. What does that mean I have to prove? Or if I'm on the other side of the fence being sued for a nuisance, how do I prove I'm following a generally accepted practice? I don't know what that means. So I think clarity there's a need for clarity there. And when it comes to like thinking of my guinea fowl, I don't know when I look at the wraps, it seems mostly from a small farm point of view, it seems mostly to do with water quality. And in the in the bill, it talked about nuisance means interference from smoke, odors, dust, noise, vibration. I don't have personal knowledge of whether or not the state regulates any of that. And so I would wonder, is that only regulated, within this bill, would that only be regulated by generally accepted practices? Which then leads me to the confusion of what is protected, what isn't. Enough said about that. The last thing that does concern me is the changing of, I think you were talking in previous testimony, you were talking about something's fallow for 10 years, then it could still be turned back into the farm.
It's 5 years.
5 or 10 years, which actually does make a lot of sense. But there's some farmland that's been sitting fallow for decades. A concern that I kind of have, which actually a neighboring farmer, he does vegetable farming in Cabot. He used to live in Massachusetts, and he was relaying to me an incident where he saw where somebody came in and opened up a pig farm in an area, and all the neighbors' property values dropped in half because of the pig farm, and there were nothing they could do about it. And that got me thinking, it's like, oh, if my neighbor put a hog house in that little piece of pasture that's near our property, that would just make our house unlivable. So the whole thing about, there used to be something about changes in the old bill, changes in farming practices and I always thought that was somewhat needed clarification, because what is changes, like if you have a vegetable farm and then you convert to a hog farm, that to the community, that's a completely different thing. And if somebody, you could have longtime Vermonters that have been living beside this vegetable farm happy forever, and now all of a sudden they're miserable because hog farms are not that, they're odoriferous, I'll say it that way. That's kind of all my points. I hope I was direct and to the point and short, and that's what I wanted to be.
Yeah, I really appreciate your coming in and sharing what you shared. I did want to ask, just out of curiosity, whether you ever consulted an attorney about the concerns you've had with any of your.
I did put an attorney on retainer. Just so I talked to an attorney, kind of saying, hey, I have this ongoing issue with my neighbor harassing me. And but he said he could react faster. I'm on retainer. I gave him some money so he'd be on retainer. But he did mention at one point it could get difficult because of the right to farm bill.
So the existing statute, and I think just I'm thinking aloud here, the existing statute only protects people who are engaged in agricultural activities. And there is a definition in existing law and in the proposed bill. So to your question about what about somebody who had a garden, somebody who had a garden probably wouldn't be afforded the protection in the law today, or the law, that might change it. But that also suggests that if your neighbor only has 3 cows, for example, and maybe that's not always 3 cows, so you have to bear that in mind too, though. But might not be protected today under the existing statute, so that anybody, the existing law covering nuisance, would apply to him just as the way it would apply to you or to me. What constitutes a nuisance is a whole nother question.
Right.
Are there anything you've described would be considered a nuisance? I don't know, but the protection that's in the law as it stands today is for people who are legitimately farming as it's defined in our statutes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an engineer, and I tend to, a retired engineer, and I tend to read things kind of very literally. And I've always had troubles figuring out, is somebody with 3 cows protected or not? It's never been clear to me.
we're just about at 12, and I want to apologize to the witnesses who were hoping to testify this morning. We may be able to, we have time this afternoon, and we may be able to reschedule some testimony after we're done on the floor. So we'll check in on that. We are, in any case, committee hoping to come back this afternoon after the floor to look at and potentially vote on S60, see if we can get that wrapped up today. So please be alert for